Good evening, Bulldog fans. As good as we can possibly make it. We've had a few of these, Steve, but few have been more disappointing than this one. The Bulldogs came in favored by a touchdown. Most of us thought rightly so. We expected a grinded-out, ugly game. Well, we got one. But the Bulldog defense was as good as they were, could not make up for lack of offensive punch. Florida calls the one shot at the one time, makes it pay off. And as a result, the Gators get out of here with a 13-6 victory that everyone really expected would go Mississippi State's way.
You know, David, you get two offensive-minded coaches together and you get a defensive struggle that was about as ugly a ball game as you could have without a bunch of turnovers. And quite frankly, State had the better of that deal. Really some of the only positives you can say, and I'll try to avoid being sarcastic, is you didn't have the unsportsmanlike conduct penalties, so you don't have that as an excuse anymore. And the defense played well enough to win again. Saved the one play. When Jonathan Abram goes down, they bring in Stephen Adegoke. I'm not blaming him. It's a great play call by Dan Mullen to go right at the fresh guy. That's what any seasoned play caller would have done. They did it. They knew that it was going to be a big gain if they got it. That ends up being the knockout punch.
Well, they had the luxury too. It was first down.
True.
Yeah, I mean, they had more plays to play with. They're certainly in field goal range at that point. So it was a great situation experiment. And the Bulldogs probably should have known that defensively, that something was coming. And Gary Green talked about it later, that they knew at some point that Dan Mullen would pull some play out of his back pocket. Well, he chose that moment when the Bulldogs were a little bit shaken, and he made it pay off. Bigger picture is, I still insist, it was not what was in the Bulldogs' heads with their former coach that had much of anything to do with tonight. It simply came down to what was in the other coach's head. I hate to say it that brutally, but this is what happens more often than not when you have a veteran SEC coach against a guy who's making his first time through the league and suddenly realizing that there's no margin for nothing anymore.
Well, here's the question that I would ask, and we can do the research on this, but how many games did Dan Mullen win here at Mississippi State scoring 13 points? Probably zero.
Ironically, won against Florida down in Gainesville.
Yeah,
I can
right.
remember. But that was in order good to see when you had a fabulous defense that year. He's not that type of defensive-minded coach, but he used his personnel to do what this team could do. He beat State up with those boundary passes, the bubble screens, the extra blockers out there, because he knew State's linebackers were not particularly good at covering or tackling out in space like that, because he knew State's personnel.
Well, that's true, David. But really, more to the point to me is one offensive touchdown in 8 quarters of SEC play. You know, we wrapped up the UL Lafayette game, even though we didn't play exceptionally well. You hit several big plays, and there was a lot of discussion on social media, message boards, and even among ourselves that a lot of these big home run plays aren't going to be available against SEC competition. Now, I'm not trying to say that Joe Moorhead lulled himself into a sense of false security, but I think he is somewhat perplexed and surprised that the Bulldogs have had these offensive struggles. And, we felt last week, okay, maybe you're overlooking Florida a little bit. Maybe that's the aberration. And then the realization tonight is maybe this is who we are offensively, and Joe Moorhead and the Bulldogs have to get back to the drawing board and figure this thing out.
Well, I think it's beyond question right now that for all our high hopes for this offensive line, it's still not there. The interior three is still solid. It was a scary moment when Darrell Williams went out, and the previous play before he got hurt, he did a great pulling guard block that sprung Nick Fitzgerald for one of the rare big runs. But the tackle play, the last 2 games, has just about been non-existent. Now, tonight they didn't draw penalties. They weren't jumping off sides except once. We had one jump by Stuart Reese. But they kept it in control. At the same time, they're just getting savaged by the edge blitzes. And Todd Grantham saw the Kentucky game. And, frankly, every defensive coordinator that State's going to see the rest of the way will watch these 2 films and say, don't attack them on the inside. Let's attack them on the edges.
Well, David, I'd say the last offensive snap of the game for Mississippi State was really a microcosm of the night. Everybody in the stadium, save maybe a couple of coaches in the maroon and white headsets, knew that Todd Grantham was going to bring the house.
Just as he did in the Alabama game in a similar 4th down situation last year with the lead that time, though.
Well, in that same situation. But you got worst case scenario for Florida. If they get burned on that, it's a tie ball game. He sells out trying to end the game, and for some reason we try to run a straight drop back, and then Nick Fitzgerald is sacked rather convincingly and emphatically. And it's one of those things you look at and you kind of scratch your head a little bit. And again, not to be overly critical, but at the same time, we're going to call it like it is. There were some times tonight when it was clear that State couldn't handle the outside pass rush. Similar to what happened last week. It wasn't as bad as last week, but there were times at night the same issues occurred, and it just seemed to be no corrective action was taken.
Well, I think as the game went on, certainly in the third quarter and sometimes the fourth, there was some more running back blocking for it. Boy, Eris Williams, he laid the lumber to somebody at one point in the game. But that's not what Joe Moorhead wants to do. He was forced into doing it. But there's still some things that State's not using. I think they had one throw to the tight ends tonight and barely one throw last week to tight ends. They're not using short intermediate routes like that. They're still convinced to go deep and long. And, hey, let's say this fairly. What if Osiris Mitchell catches about, not a perfect pass, but about as well thrown as Nick Fitzgerald can put it on his hands, he's 3 steps from a touchdown. You put State up 13-3 at that point, and it's a whole nother ball game.
It's true, David, and that's one of the things when you look at as erratic as Nick was at times and as frustrating the offensive was at times, you look at that play and you think, you know what? You called the play, you got your guy open, your quarterback threw one of his best balls of the night, and then you couldn't complete the play. And that's not to dump on Osiris Mitchell, but an SEC receiver is going to make that play. And that proved, I think, and really in many respects, it kind of let the wind out of the sails. And Osiris has been the leading receiver for whatever that's worth. Mm-hmm. But the bottom line was that was a game-changing play, and Mississippi State didn't make it. And as a result, Mississippi State is 3-2.
Well, also, State gets the big turnover they're looking for. A deflected pass by Earl Thompson. Cam Dancer comes down with it. You're at the 50-yard line already, and you get nothing done with that. And there were a couple – certainly the first down pass was there. It just didn't happen. So you see – you can sit there and see, and I'm sure to some extent we'll see this week, the coaches say that we're close. And, yes, they were against Kentucky and Florida. Close doesn't get it in the SEC anymore because you can't give those away. Willie Gay, now there's a reason he's playing defense instead of offense, but he has a pick six on his hands there in the second quarter that really would have gotten Florida out of sync. So you see those close calls. Do you take any solace from those in their possible, or you sit there and say, we shouldn't have to rely on those. This offense should be much more consistent than this.
I think that's exactly right, David. And here's the thing about all of that as we hear a siren wind off into the distance here at Davis Wade, is that winning teams make those plays, and those plays count. You know, a dropped interception is an incompletion in the books. It's as simple as that. You might get a pass breakup if you're lucky, but, you know, pass breakups aren't game changers more times than not. Those are plays that winning teams make, and that's the difference between winning and losing. Yes, you make that play, you make these other ones. It kind of is reminiscent of the Sylvester Croom era in some respects, and I know that sounds sacrilegious, but I'm going to say it because it reminds me of some of those, well, you know, 2 or 3 plays here. Well, all those plays count, and Mississippi State didn't make them. And this is an offense we expected this to kind of be our strong suit. We knew we were going to be pretty salty on defense, and we are. We didn't think we would struggle the way we have offensively, and I think that is the rub in the whole thing. I think every Bulldog fan tonight is thinking we went out and hired an offensive-minded coach, and then we can't score in our league. And that's the scary part of all of this is that if we don't seem to have made any progress one week to the next after getting punched in the mouth last week, we didn't respond well tonight.
I know some players are trying to bring back the Georgia-Auburn stretch last year when State was shut down consecutive games big. But that was 2 teams that were in the college football playoff, essentially, or championship. Kentucky and Florida, as solid as they are not of that caliber this year. They certainly don't look that way. You never know. But the point being, the Bulldog offense is not producing. Coach Moorhead was asked directly about, second week in a row, the lack of total running plays, and he had an honest explanation that the read pass option is in there, and it ends up with either Nick throwing or keeping more often than handing off because he's reading. We still have the same complaint, though. Those plays are taking so dadgum long to develop that all a defensive lineman has to do is look at the play clock, and he knows when to jump the count.
Well, not only that, too, David, you know, and Joe was asked about that again. He goes, you know, he said our goal is to get the best play call based on the defensive look, and that's true. But the fact that you almost get predictable when it gets down and the crowd starts counting down and getting anxious, you know, when you get down 4 or 5 seconds to go on the play clock, I mean, and you're looking at the sideline still trying to get lined up. It's difficult to catch somebody off guard when they know you're fixing to snap the football. And I think that's one of the things that helped their pass rushers too, is because, like you say, they can kind of pin their ears back and say, you know what, there's 1 second to go, it's time to go. You can't surprise anybody with a quick count or anything like that when the clock's winding down. But, you know, David, we could talk about this all night. The bottom line is it's a very frustrating loss for our fan base. There were 2 games entering the season Mississippi State fans had circled and said these are games we can't lose. Florida and Ole Miss. We've lost one in a very frustrating fashion. And I don't know, David, when we're going to see this stadium to fill the capacity again, to be quite honest with you.
It was the 10th largest crowd in stadium history, and to their credit, most everybody stayed well into the 4th quarter. Now, how many come back next weekend? That's going to be a verdict there, but I've already had some Twitter arguments, and I'm sure you will this week as well. And by the way, I see some fake Twitter accounts out there trying to talk about controversy in the locker room between the coach and players there. Folks, be careful what you're reading on social media, even from us sometimes. Just watch out for it. But the point being, the Bulldogs have a lot to get fixed. Auburn's coming in. The Tigers have struggled on offense themselves, but have a very salty defense. So it's fair to expect probably a pretty similar game next week. But again, you have a veteran coach on one sideline and a first-year coach who, yes, he's been in the game quite a while, but now he's the one making the decisions. He's the one deciding who plays, and he said everything's open this week at all positions, but I'm not sure what changes you can make at this point. So how does Moorhead adjust what he does? We can't answer that, and I'm not sure he'll have an answer for us on Monday either. But time's going to show, does this Bulldog team come anywhere close to achieving what we thought this club was capable of?
Well, the bottom line, the talent's there. I mean, that's as simple as that. You know what, Nick Fitzgerald's an option-style quarterback. He's never going to be a pocket passer, but you can run some routes and some different passing concepts and get him in some looks that.
Could we please throw to the tight end some?
You're preaching to the choir. But you know, Dave, again, we can talk all night about this. So bottom line is this, it's Joe Moorhead's job to fix it, and he's being paid quite handsomely to do so. And so that's the expectation now. Find a way to move the football, find a way to score points.
So, as bitter as it is to say, congratulations to Dan Mullen and Scott Strickland, who get to leave Starkville as winners in this game. I did see Scott briefly, and for a guy who once worked for me ages ago, we can be civil, and congratulations, because he's in a tough job down there. It's hard to take, and it's going to be a really rough week for us dealing with our job with a very impassioned fan base. But you know what? I'd rather our fans care and be mad, even if it's mad at us, than just giving up on this team and getting blasé about it. So I'm not going to say hang in there. I'm just going to say let's see what happens in the coming week. Joe Moorhead will be facing the media at noon on Monday. He'll be at his call-in show on Thursday at the Veranda as well. We get offensive players on Tuesday, defensive players on Wednesday. Be interesting to see if we're restricted in who we have access to this week. But I think at some point you got to let the dogs step forward and talk for themselves, because this is a veteran team, and they, even more than we and fans, are disappointed.
There's no doubt about it, David. I mean, you know, as much as we all care, we're not out there every day. We're not competing for jobs. We're not getting our hands stepped on. We're not getting yelled at. You know, we're not having to deal with all that. You know, and while we make a choice, you know, to be as emotionally invested as we are, and more times than not, we've been able to get great reward for that the last decade or so. But nobody's more invested in these players and coaches. They don't need me to speak for them. And you know, that's the thing. These players, more times than not, you know, they're going to feel this so much more deeply than we are. And so my hope is they find a way to turn it around. There's some really good kids on this team and some fine young men that we expect big things from in life. And I hope they can close out the season and give this fan base something to be proud of.
So we go into October. Next week's game is a sellout. That means you've got your tickets. If you don't show up, well, I guess that's your right, because you paid your support, you've shown your support, so nobody's going to criticize you for doing that. But remember, you only get 7 opportunities to be at Scott Field for a game. So come, tailgate, enjoy it. We'll find out for sure what time kickoff is, 6:30. They were waiting till this evening's results to get all that in. Steve and I will be talking again Monday, giving a rundown of what Joe Moore had to say, what he didn't say, and what we surmised that he maybe should or could have said. But that'll be Monday. For now, I've got a game story to write. Steve, you've got to go start checking on recruits, you and Paul, on how this turned out, a big visit weekend. And we've talked about as long as we know how to talk at this point, and I'm beginning to think those sirens are probably coming to take us away at this point. So, from Scott Field, disappointing Bulldogs, again, losing to Florida Gators as State falls to 3-2 overall, 0-2 in the SEC, hosting Auburn next weekend in what is an absolutely beyond question a must-win game for the Bulldogs. For Steve Robertson, this is David Murray.